Nigeria's President Bola Tinubu is calling for international cooperation to combat violent extremism in Africa. In his first speech at the UN General Assembly, Tinubu touted the need to prioritize Africa's development and foster mutually beneficial partnerships. State House correspondent Adesua Omoruan reports.
The United Nations General Assembly debate commenced with Secretary General Guterres offering a frank assessment of the state of the world.
Our world is becoming unhinged. Geopolitical tensions are rising. Global challenges are mounting. And we seem incapable of coming together to respond. We confront a host of existential threats, from the climate crisis to disruptive technologies, and we do so at a time of chaotic transition.
World leaders took turns to highlight pressing global issues. Amidst this, Nigeria's Bola Tinubu listened to fellow leaders and engaged in sideline meetings, including discussions with King of Jordan and the President of Angola. After over 20 world leaders, Tinubu finally stepped onto the world's biggest diplomatic stage for his first address.
On behalf of the people of Nigeria,
President Tinubu highlights Africa's unique challenges rooted in a history of unfulfilled promises and exploitation. He urged global cooperation to support Africa's development.
Many proclamations have been made, yet our troubles remain close at hand. Failures in good governance have hindered Africa, but broken promises, unfair treatment, and outright exploitation from abroad have also exerted a heavy toll on our ability to progress. Given this long history, if this year's theme is to mean anything at all, it must mean something special and particular to Africa.
Tinubu commits to leading by example through reforms in Nigeria, accepting short-term hardships for long-term growth.
The question is not whether Nigeria is open for business. The question is how much of the world is truly open to doing business with Nigeria, and how African is an equal, mutually beneficial manner. Direct investment in critical industries, opening airports to a wider range and larger quantity of African exports, and meaningful debt relief are important aspects of the cooperation we seek.
On the issue of climate,
I'm now being joined from Arise Abuja studio for greater reflection on these comments by the Nigerian president by Ambassador Usman Sarki, who worked in the Permanent Secretariat of the African Union to the United Nations in Geneva and was one-time Director, Office of the Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Ambassador Sarki also served as Ambassador and Deputy Permanent Representative at the Permanent Mission of Nigeria to the United Nations in New York. Good to see you, Ambassador Usman Sarki. Thank you for joining me on This Day Live, the Sunday Talk Show.
Thank you, Dr. Abati. Thank you for having me on your program.
Well, Ambassador, President Tinubu had his maiden outing on the floor of the United Nations General Assembly, UNGA 78th, focusing on sustainable development goals for the benefit of all humanity, sustainable peace, progress, and solidarity for all. What's your assessment of his speech at that United Nations General Assembly, which many have described as brilliant and Afrocentric?
Yes, thank you very much. And let me also say how honored I am to join my two senior colleagues, the professors. Mr. President's speech was a landmark event, especially considering that that was his first outing on the global stage in the United Nations. So it was a very important moment in his career as president, being also the chief diplomatic officer of the country. His speech has been well received by the world, by Nigerians, both at home and in the diaspora. The contents of the speech were appropriate to the moment, appropriate to the occasion, and it rose up to the expectations of Nigerians in terms of addressing the various challenges facing our country, our region, West Africa, and our continent, and of course the entire global community. So the speech was well focused, well crafted, and well delivered, as it is to be expected of a country like Nigeria, the president of a country like Nigeria. So it was very heartwarming, development to see us, our country, represented at that level in such a very competent, assured, confident, and knowledgeable manner.
Well, Ambassador, let me ask you, one of the issues raised in that address by President Tinubu was what you called the need to transform the United Nations. And he raised this also with the United Nations General Secretary, who talked about reform. Now, do you think that there's any hope that the UN system will get the reform that stakeholders have been asking for since the emergence of the consensus group and the African group, and also the group of other countries who provide funding but cannot get a permanent seat on the UN Security Council?
Yes, Doctor. Reform actually in the United Nations encompasses a very broad area, a very broad field, and many issues. If you remember, I think in 2000 or 2002, the former Secretary General, His Excellency late Kofi Annan, launched his book or initiative called Enlarger Freedom, in which the reform of the United Nations institutions were actually proposed and outlined. As a result of that, in 2005, the Human Rights Commission, or the Commission of Human Rights, was transformed into the Human Rights Council. And also the Peace Building Commission was established, and also other processes in the UN were harmonized in accordance with the dictates of the times and the needs of member states. So reform is a continuous process. In the General Assembly, for instance, we are discussing the reform of the proceedings and procedures of the General Assembly so that inclusivity will be reflected, and also the decisions, the way voting patterns are taking place and so forth, can be made more transparent and also reflective of the global tendencies or the global governance requirements. But because of the interest that the world is showing in the Security Council, the reform of the United Nations has been always conceived in the framework of the Security Council, particularly the expansion of the membership of the Council and creating additional seats in the permanent category and addressing the issue of the veto power. So the reform in the UN encompasses a larger field. So Mr. President's speech actually wants to generate a discussion, a debate, some sort of framework around which consensus can be reached on proper, constructive, and meaningful reform of the institutions of global governance, not necessarily as a cosmetic show, but to deliver on commitments and promises. For instance, the UN Secretary General has said that only 15% of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, have been achieved, while about now 75 or 80 or thereabout % is left in abeyance. So that will require some sort of push and momentum on the parts of member states. Climate change commitments are not being made. Sustainable development commitments are not being made. Peacekeeping commitments are being rolled back. So you find that we need an aggregation of discussions around those issues of interest to us to make the global institutions meaningful. So that is the larger dimension of the Mr. President's speech. Mr. President has also spoken on the deliverance of commitments, deliverance of services and goods to the global south in terms of the engagement and interaction between member states and the United Nations. So as far as your question goes, Dr. Abati, whether reform can be achieved or not, we have achieved reforms in some general areas, but the most critical one that is hoped for by the world, which is the reform of the Security Council, it will be a tall order, a very tough call, difficult process, tortuous, and also full of contortions and obstacles along the way. You remember we started this in 1965 when the membership was expanded from 6 to 10, non-permanent category. Since then, we have been speaking about the reform and expansion of memberships, and we have got nowhere. So it will be a very gradual process. It will take patience, perseverance, and engagement with all the member states in order to arrive at a consensus on how to move. And my final word on this issue, before I give you the floor, sir, is that even the countries, the non-permanent member countries, are divided on their conception of what the reform of the Security Council should entail. We are broken into smaller groups, into smaller affiliate bodies and so forth, without a larger consensus of how to move forward. Even in Africa, our consensus on the principles of the Esselwini consensus, but we have no agreement whether we should ask for 2 or 3 positions on the council, and whether we should now seek for the veto power or not, or which countries should actually be privileged to go and sit on the council. So we'll settle on the larger compromise of rotation of our members, and that will be really unfeasible to rotate the membership of the permanent category. So you see there are lots of difficulties entailed ahead of us to overcome.
Okay, Ambassador, what I've tried to do is to take together President Tinubu's address on the floor of the United Nations General Assembly and his meeting on the sidelines with the UN Secretary General. But one other thing that I noticed is that all the African leaders that spoke were talking about partnership. President William Ruto of Kenya talked about partnership, that Africa should not be treated as if it's a subordinate party. President Tinubu himself talked about cooperation and partnership. President Akufo-Addo of Ghana talked about problems in Africa being due to historical injustices. And also President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa almost echoed more or less the same lines and the importance of Africa. So you find these African leaders all trying to blame the West, you know, for the travails of the African continent. But none of them, even with President Tinubu talking about coups in Africa, illegal exploitation of resources, failed to talk about the crisis of leadership on the continent. It was on this, within the same frame of time that President Paul Kagame of Rwanda granted an interview to say that he was seeking a 4th term, and he didn't care what anybody outside, you know, was saying, that as long as his people wanted him, he would be there. This is the problem. And African leaders going to the UN General Assembly, they are not blaming themselves. The poor leadership that they offer, the sit-tight syndrome on the African continent. Don't you think that the West will think these people coming to ask for partnership and cooperation, they are the problem, where they are pushing the blame to other people?
Yes, indeed. I think, you know, we should look at issues critically, our positions also, whether we are coming from the position of strength or weakness, and whether actually, you know, there is some righteousness in our disposition or not. For instance, partnership, as you correctly pointed out, was very central to the speeches of many heads of state. And it is actually goal number 17 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals they are addressing to, which establish the framework for global partnerships in transiting to the next stage of development based on sustainability, addressing global challenges, and building institutions. So I suspect they were speaking within that context of partnership. But when it comes to local issues, national, regional, and continental issues, there are certain deficits that we must acknowledge if we are honest with ourselves. For instance, how much of the African Union's targets and objectives have we met in the continent? By 2022, I think, or 23, not by 2021 or so, we were supposed to silence the guns in Africa. The date came and passed. We did not silence the guns. The guns are blazing in many parts of the continent. We have adopted the Program on Infrastructure Development in Africa, PIDA, or PIDA. How much cohesion have we got in terms of traction towards achieving that in Africa is difficult to say. We have adopted the framework AU Agenda 2063, which actually should mobilize the resources of the continent, build partnerships internally and externally outside Africa to achieve the general upliftment of the economy and well-being of the African nations. How far have we actually gone in addressing these issues? So you find that when we go abroad to speak to leaders, we tend to become hesitant about putting concrete proposals forward based on decisions taken by our own leaders, either in Addis Ababa or in other venues of the African Union. So you are quite right. We are actually crippling our efforts, our initiatives, by not paying attention to rule of law, to legality, to constitutionalism, and also to good governance. And these are issues by which we are being judged and we are being held up to account and for examination. So if we go to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, for instance, the main themes over there are actually based on the delivery of good governance, on rule of law, respect for human rights, and so forth. How far are we actually down the road towards respecting those issues? So it is very important we put our house in order, our homes in order to speak authoritatively and with a modicum of moral integrity to other people, other interlocutors with whom we are working to create partnerships. So I don't think you can be faulted in making that reservation or demarche in terms of our own preparedness to preach to others what to do. But Mr. President's speech acknowledged our shortcomings, actually, internally in Africa, and he called for actually the termination of impunity in terms of these arbitrary changes in government, unconstitutional changes in government, elongation, and so forth. So a change is coming, and Nigeria is leading that change, happily, and we should now give the benefit of the doubt to our president to see how far he can lead us on the road to rejuvenation and the renaissance of the African continent in terms of governance and politics.
Well, in terms of appearance, Ambassador, why is it that the Nigerian president was made to address the General Assembly at an ungodly hour of about 1 a.m., addressing a largely empty hall, very scanty representation, by which time most of the people who should have been there had gone home? But President Ramaphosa of South Africa was given a prime time slot. Do you think that that was a deliberate attempt to slight Nigeria, and that our permanent mission to the United Nations dropped the ball in that regard? Shouldn't heads roll for making our president speak at an ungodly hour to an empty hall?
Yeah. Well, Doctor, I'm sure you know what is obtaining in the UN. You have been part of this for a number of times, at least 4 or 5 ONGA sessions that you attended. And you know how the slotting of countries is done. Unfortunately, yes, our president spoke around 11 or 12 midnight, and the hall was not really packed full as we would expect. I think, it depends on the choice, the representation we made, the engagement negotiations we did, if there was a vigorous engagement with other parties by our delegation, we could have secured an earlier slot because member countries are willing to trade positions, so we can approach the UN Secretariat and tell them the time they gave us, by then everybody would be asleep in Nigeria, and that we would like a daytime slot, and that could be negotiated. So perhaps, from the benefit of what has happened, hindsight, next year we should be better prepared so that we can get a better slot for Mr. President.
Well, on the sidelines of the General Assembly, the President also met with prospective investors, met with the Nigerian community, telling Nigerians in diaspora to come back home, and that if they had witnessed frustrations with the previous administration, change is now here, hope is now here. What is the value of these meetings that are held on the sidelines at this international fora, when it is very clear that oftentimes the Foreign Affairs Ministry and relevant other ministries, fail to follow up and actualize some of the pledges that may be received?
Yes, I agree with you entirely that we need to build up the capacities of our institutions, particularly line ministries, where commitments and agreements will be implemented, because they are responsible. Mr. President has only so much to do in terms of advancing the interests of Nigeria. And where he stops, that is where the ministers and the bureaucracy of the government should take over to vigorously prosecute those issues, interrogate them, and also see that they are implemented. And then reports are sent back to the president to say that on this date, on such and such a date, you met with such and such a community, you gave such an undertaking, and we, as the line ministry, these are the actions that we have taken, and this is the resultant effects of those actions. So it's very important that we should have coordination in the government. And not only that, we should have exchange of ideas and views. We should not really, create walls around us, firewalls around us, insulating each ministry or each department from the other. Mr. President, it is his duty, it is prerogative and privilege to engage with Nigerians in the diasporas, to engage with investors, to engage with institutional organizations to advance Nigeria's interests and priorities. However, it is now left for the ministers, the people in the president's entourage, to take notes, to take proper notes of those conversations. And once they come back, they develop memoranda out of that, and then those memorandums should now be faithfully circulated within the establishment to lead to the questioning of the premises for the implementation of those, and then to lead to action on the part of responsible departments so that a report can now go back to the president. So we need to fine-tune the mechanism of action at home, particularly in the foreign policy area, because we have 109 missions, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And each mission is there to represent the country, and each head of mission is there to represent Mr. President as his principal representative. So every line that the missions and the ambassadors or high commissioners send back to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs must be examined diligently, and the scope for their implementation and action must be established within the ministry. And beyond that, the sharing of information by way of movement of memorandum from one ministry to the other must be brought back in order to create linkages so that effective decision-making can be done, and also the creation of conditions for the implementations of agreements should be arrived at. So I agree with you fully, sir, that the bureaucracy must really keep up with the pace at which Mr. President is going.
On that note, I would like to thank you very much, Ambassador Usman Sarki, former Deputy Permanent Representative of Nigeria to the United Nations, for joining me on This Day Live, this Sunday talk show here on Arise News. Thank you very much indeed.